Welcome back to Lighthouse and Architecture. My name is Basil, and if you're watching this show, then you already know it's all about lighthouse and architecture. I am in the nation's capital of the Bahamas to find more information about the black Seminoles, Seminole Indians that fled in boats to Andros Island. I'll be sitting down with Dr. Grace Turner, an archaeologist specializing in Bahamian history. This episode will contain a great deal of dates and history, so put on your thinking caps. Dr. Turner has so much knowledge that I couldn't get it all within this episode, but I promise you I'm putting it all in the podcast. In the meantime, go ahead, like, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications so you can see more episodes like this in the future. Now, Dr. Turner.
In the Seminole Wars, leading up to the 1820s, they started about 1815, but between about 1814 and 1820, the Seminoles had a very contentious relationship with the fairly new United States government. Florida remained Spanish territory until 1821. It became U.S. territory. And then there was a full-on court press by the U.S. Army to pretty much move the Seminoles out of the way. And the Seminoles, they're a conglomeration of native groups, but they had moved into Florida. And with them, always, there would have been some blacks who more than likely would have run away from slavery on plantations, and they remained with the Native Americans. Before Florida became U.S. territory, the Seminole leaders understood that at some point there was going to come a crisis, and at least twice they had contingents come over to New Providence to make a case to the British governor in Nassau to give them help. Because in the War of 1812, with Great Britain and the new U.S. government, the Seminoles as a tribe were on the side of the British. And the British promised the Seminoles that if they ever needed help, just call and ask and they would help them. So that's why these chiefs, Chief Osceola came in 1817. And the records note that when Osceola came, he had a black translator who was bilingual, so he could speak English and Seminole. Then in 1819, an older Chief Kenaji, he came, and they were all making the case. They wanted help and assistance. The record isn't specific, but evidently the Seminoles wanted assistance for any blacks living with them or anyone of any mixed race. Because in the U.S., if you were known to have any African ancestry and slavery was still on, you were liable to be resold as a slave because they would assume you were a runaway. And the Seminole chiefs were wanting to avoid that. The governor in Nassau at the time was an acting governor. He wasn't appointed directly from London. He was a local white. And the local whites had a very different attitude than the colonial officials from London. The local whites really couldn't care less about those kinds of details. He was polite, he entertained them, but he didn't give them any help. And in 1821, Colonel Andrew Jackson was leading the contingent of the army that was pursuing all of these Seminoles to eliminate them or drive them onto reservations in Florida. And any blacks he came across, any maroon communities of blacks, they were being captured, they were liable to be resold as slaves. And a group of these blacks, some of them would have been living with the Seminoles, but some of them would have been in those black maroon communities. In 1821, and Colonel Jackson and his team, they destroyed a black maroon community in north central Florida that was locally known as Angola. The archaeology of that has only recently been done within the last 3-4 years. But when these persons were found, they said that they got to St. Augustine and they contracted a white Bahamian boat captain to take them to the Bahamas. And that boat captain, his name was Captain Mott. Understanding the dynamics of who these people were, what was happening, he opted to land them on the west coast of Andros. All of the settlements in Andros are on the east coast. The west coast is at sea level. It's very swampy. It's not as hospitable as the east coast, but he landed them on the west coast because he already knew and understood that on the west coast, it was going to take some time before the authorities would even notice them. And he was quite right, because not until 1828, the Controller of Customs made a report to the governor that they had discovered 97 Negroes, as he described it. So that's when we understood that that group, none of them were full-blooded Native Americans. Some of them would have been mixed race. Some evidently were all black. But there were 97 in the group, and they had a listing of their names in the group who were landed at Red Base. And the question for the colonial officials at that point was, who are these people? They're black, and even in the British territories like the Bahamas, slavery was still on. Black people don't just show up. Are they runaways? Are these slaves being smuggled into Cuba? That was the big question. And in investigating, some of the men in this group at Red Base could show papers where they fought with the British at the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812. And by that time, by 1828, there was a governor from London, Governor Sir James Carmichael Smith. He was a pro-abolitionist, so he was really sympathetic to issues impacting free black slaves. And he made the ruling that since these people were not listed as slaves on any slave register in the Bahamas, then his ruling was, it meant that they were not slaves. They should be treated as free people. And so they were allowed to stay at Red Base. They were not bothered. And the community continued there until a disastrous hurricane in 1866 that caused extensive flooding. And Red Base, the original site, a hurricane like that had a lot of flooding, they had a lot of problems. And the government at the time told them they were going to refuse to give them any assistance unless they moved further inland, because this would happen again. And so the current location of the settlement of Red Base is about 3 miles further inland from that original site. But a number of the people at Red Base opted to even move from there. And so they moved to other settlements like Nicholstown and Low Sound in North Andros, but they also went to parts of South Andros. They spread from there pretty much because of their surnames. We could understand that they did that because the surname Lewis, the Lewis surname, is one of the names that was introduced into the Bahamas with that group. And we know that the Lewis family, it's Lewis, Russell, McQueen, Riley, Newton, any number of names like that. Most of them remained in Andros, but a lot of them were no longer limited to Red Base. And that has continued even to today. And we understood, too, that first group was pretty well documented in the records in Nassau. We realized through oral histories that there very likely were other waves of migration coming in, not just that initial one. And so when you spoke about the Lighthouse and how it was a part of the Underground Railroad, because the information about this location would have gotten back to people, especially in Florida, and they would have known. Once you get to the Bahamas, you go to Andros, and they would have known which side of Andros to go to. And so the later migrations are not as well documented in the official records in Nassau, but we realized that this was an ongoing issue for some time after 1821.
That brings this episode to an end. Join me next time when I visit Sunny Isles Beach, Florida, and get a grand tour of a luxury high-rise condo. Best part is, Hernan Arriaga is doing the showcase for this. This is his work, and it's an exclusive designer for luxury condos and homes. Until next time, see ya!